Hello! Recently I got back from a fun family vacation in California. Since there was going to be a lot of driving on this trip, all the way from driving from Vegas to California and then driving from Orange County to San Diego, back to Orange County again, and then to Los Angeles. I tried to bring art supplies and projects that would work well with a lot of driving. I also wanted to pack a watercolor sketchbook that was small enough that I could paint in impromptu places as we were going. So in today's video, I'll show you the fun things I made to bring on the trip, and then tell you how it went and what worked and what didn't. For the past year or so, I've had a major dilemma around whether to use cold press or hot press watercolor paper in my work. In the beginning of my watercolor journey, everyone recommended cold press watercolor paper, and so that's what I used and have been using it ever since. If you're not familiar with the difference between these types of paper, an easy way to think about it is that cold press watercolor paper has that slightly bumpy surface that's really famous and used a lot in watercolor painting. When you think of watercolor paper, that's probably what you're thinking of. It's really absorbent and you need to use a lot of water because the paper will soak the water and the pigment in it pretty quickly. However, cold press paper is not ideal for doing a lot of pencil drawing on your paper first. It works better for light sketches and more loose paintings rather than really highly detailed work and drawings. Hot press paper, by contrast, is really smooth. At first, I hated it because the paint and water just sit right on top of the paper and they take a bit to then soak into the paper. It's not as absorbent initially, and so it can be a little bit harder to work with, especially if you're used to cold press paper. However, the more my art style comes forward, the more I'm finding that I prefer a lot of detail in my pieces. I've felt really limited in that when I sketch something out beforehand, I really like how it comes together because I'm not sketching it on watercolor paper. But then when I go to paint it, I lose a lot of that detail and sharpness that I had in my sketches. Over the past year, I've also seen a lot of artists that I admire who are using primarily hot press watercolor paper in their work. And it's made me want to give hot press paper another chance. So before my trip, I searched high and wide for a nice, small hot press watercolor paper sketchbook that I could bring. But I had a really difficult time finding something that had a high enough paper quality that I was looking for, and that was the right sizing so that I could really do a proper test with trying hot press paper. The truth is that not all watercolor paper is created equal, and your paper honestly can make or break your watercolor paintings. I honestly thought I wasn't that good at watercolor painting until a few years ago when I started to upgrade my watercolor paper. And then I found using the same techniques, the same paints, that the paintings turned out so much better and looked more how I had wanted them to look. The gold standard for watercolor paper is Arch's 300-pound paper, whether it's cold pressed or hot pressed. Their cold pressed paper is what I upgraded to a few years ago, and it changed the game for my paintings to the point where I just don't even want to use any other type of paper now. My concern was that if I bought a hot press watercolor sketchbook that wasn't Arch's paper, because they don't sell their watercolor paper in small sketchbooks, at least not here in the US, then as I was testing it, I would get used to how that hot press paper worked. And then when I went to go do my larger paintings on the Arch's watercolor paper, then I'd have to test it all over again and get used to it while working on my bigger, more detailed pieces. In theory, it sounds like watercolor paper really shouldn't be that big of a deal. And I remember in the beginning of my watercolor journey, when watercolorists would talk about this, my eyes would just glaze over and I would especially get really disenchanted with the conversation as soon as I looked at the price of what it costs to use Arch's watercolor paper. It's not cheap paper, but there are so many variables that you're constantly working with when you're painting with watercolor. And it's been extremely frustrating to me over the years when I'm not using the same kind of watercolor paper and keep switching back and forth, because you naturally get used to the amount of water and pigment ratios that are needed to get the results that you want. And every time you adjust your paper, you have to adjust those watercolor and pigment ratios slightly as well, so that you can get what you're looking for out of that paper. Some watercolor paper absorbs water really quickly, even if it's hot pressed or cold pressed. Some watercolor paper requires a lot more pigment to really have it be vibrant and look really alive in your painting. So it's just one more thing to manage while you're trying to do your painting, rather than just doing the actual painting. So after wrestling with this dilemma probably way longer than was needed, I decided to squeeze in making my own sketchbook to bring on the trip. I've made quite a few sketchbooks before, so I wasn't intimidated by the process, but it was definitely adding one more thing to the plate of all the other things that we had to do to get ready to go on our trip. And remember, I work a full-time job, as does my husband, and so anytime I'm creating stuff, it's before or after work and or on weekends. So I tried to do this project a little bit inconspicuously so it wouldn't stress my family out. I'd like to show you just a short behind the scenes of how to make a sketchbook, especially so you can see it's a really doable project. I learned how to do this from the Sketchbook Design and Binding course by Mauro Godis on Domestika. I'll put the link in the comments. And if you're really wanting to figure this out for yourself, my short overview won't be enough, and you'll really want to check out that course so you have all the details and are set up for success. Part 1, prepping the paper inside of the sketchbook. The most affordable way to buy watercolor paper is to buy it in a roll. But since I'm still not sure 100% if I'm going to make that switch from cold pressed to hot pressed, I didn't dare invest in a big roll of hot pressed paper that I may or may not use in the future. So I decided to just buy a pad of Arch's hot pressed watercolor paper to make the sketchbook with. I wanted the sketchbook to only be about 5 by 5 inches, so I cut the sheets down to 5 by 10 rectangles so that I could fold them in half and have them be a perfect 5 by 5. Then I poked holes in the paper to stitch it together. Then I started stitching all the pages together to make the inside of the sketchbook. This is honestly one of my favorite parts. It might be because I love needles and thread so much, but I think this part is really therapeutic. Part 2, prepping the spine and your book insert. Once the sketchbook pages are stitched together, it's time to glue their spine and then let it sit and dry. When the spine is dry, it's time to glue your end papers on. I tried using parchment paper this time for this. I personally love having a ribbon in all of my sketchbooks. I use them both to help me find my place and also because they look really pretty in the sketchbook as well. So I burned the end of this cute ribbon I found in my stash to keep the end from fraying and then glued it to the spine. Then it was time to attach the headbands. These little cloth pieces help protect and keep dust out of the spine, and they look so pretty and professional too when it's done. I then attached the hinge cloth that further protects the spine and helps keep your book together. When you're making a sketchbook for watercolor painting, it's crucial to have a really nice, strong spine, so you're less likely to have water damage in your book as you start using it later on. Now I'm almost done with everything for the inside of the sketchbook. The last step is to make a little Oxford hollow, which is a piece of paper you fold into thirds and glue so it's like a little pocket. This keeps your book more flexible and helps it open more easily because you glue the Oxford hollow to the spine, and then when you attach your cover, you attach it to the Oxford hollow rather than directly to your cover. Part 3, prepping the cover. First, you cut the chipboard out to fit the front and back covers and a small piece for the spine. Then it's time to build the cover using your bookbinding cloth. This handy tool helps me measure everything and get the sizing just right and is crucial and makes this part a lot easier than it looks. Now, I got a little crazy in the next part. I wasn't loving the solid green bookbinding cloth, and if you've been watching me for a while, you know that I love embroidering book covers for my sketchbooks. So even though I was crunched for time, I decided to quickly try to build an embroidered cover for this sketchbook. My reasoning here was that I thought I'd be much more likely to stay really engaged with this sketchbook and really give that hot press paper a fighting chance if I felt really connected to the book and loved looking at the book and the feel of the book, which naturally happens when I do an embroidered cover. However, the wild part was that I thought I could squeeze in getting this embroidered cover completely done and embroidered and bound to the book before we left on our trip, which was all less than a week of time. So I measured out the linen cloth to fit the book cover. I had this vision to try to embroider a rose inspired by the gorgeous watercolor sketches inside of Rosie Sanders' Roses book. I just love how loose and lovely these are. They definitely provide a lot of creative inspiration to me. I loved this sketch in particular and thought it would be so fun to embroider. So I drew a rose roughly in a similar shape onto my linen cloth and some other words and designs I thought might be fun for the cover as well. Then I put it into my embroidery hoop so it was ready to start embroidering. Now it was time to hop back over to glue the bookbinding cloth to the chipboard, which you still need to do even with an embroidered cover because it helps the cover stay together and be able to weather getting a bit of water or other elements on it. This is a messy part of the process and you have to move pretty quickly. Once I finished gluing the cover, I let it and the inside of the sketchbook sit for a few days since I wanted to embroider the new cover. Over the next few days, I really hustled trying to get the embroidery done on the cover. Every spare minute I could snag, I was spending embroidering, even to the point where my arm and wrist were starting to get a little bit sore from overdoing it. I had so much fun trying to imitate the pencil lines in her sketch with my needle and thread. But ultimately, this was an insane thing to try to rush and push into this week. I just didn't have enough time to get it done before the trip, sadly. So I decided to take it with me on the trip instead. So on the night before the trip, I had to surrender and build my sketchbook without the embroidered cover. I attached the elastic band to the outside and then glued the spine to the cover. And then I glued these pretty end pages to the cover and the sketchbook pages together to finish it up. Ultimately, it turned out really pretty and I was so excited to use it after all. Doing art on our family trip in California. It all ended up working out perfectly. I knew that embroidery would be an ideal thing to bring for all of those long hours of driving. Out of the 7 people in our family, 5 of us can drive. So it was really fun to know that this trip I wouldn't have to do a lot of driving and instead I could be doing some artsy stuff in the car instead. I figured that I'd still work on the flower cover and then I could either attach it to my new little sketchbook later or use it for my next little watercolor sketchbook that I'll make in the future. I figured out a super fun thing in our car that I could mirror my phone to the little car screen, which made it so I could have my reference photo handy and then was embroidering a lot of the time and it made the drive so much more fun. By the end of the trip, I had the rose mostly done and I'm really happy with how it's coming together. It was such a fun project to take on my trip. My little watercolor sketchbook worked out perfectly too. I packed my art supplies when we went to the San Diego Safari Park and I was so glad I did. The safari park was incredible. I had never been, but I am now a huge raving fan. It was so amazing to see the animals in a much more natural habitat than a typical zoo. One of my favorite parts was the tram where they take you through this massive area that's like an African plain where you get to see a lot of different species all living together like giraffes, rhinoceros, and gazelles. While we were waiting for the elephant tour, I pulled out my sketchbook and did this quick painting of the buildings near where we were waiting. I was so inspired by the elephants that I also painted them into my sketchbook later from some photos I took. I also took my sketchbook when our family went to the beach. It was heavenly to sit and paint while my kids played in the water. The only craziness came was when my little nephew was playing in the sand nearby and accidentally got so wild and so excited that he threw a bunch of sand up on my wet painting and into my wet watercolor palette. But it cleaned up easy enough and it adds some character to those paintings and is a really funny memory that I'll always have when I look at this painting. All in all, we had such a lovely time on our family trip together, and it was so fun to incorporate my art into the trip in these small, fun ways. I always think I'm going to get a lot more painting done on a trip than I ever actually do, but I'm still committed to testing and working with the hot press paper moving forward to see if I want to make that switch also for my bigger pieces. So since I've been home, I've been painting in it, and it's been really fun to keep going with that sketchbook. I am really loving so far how much easier it is to draw on the hot press paper, and as I keep experimenting, I'll definitely keep you updated. So what did you create this week? Any fun projects? Let me know in the comments. I can't wait to hear about it. In the meantime, know that I'm cheering you on this week in fanning those creative sparks and making some magic with your everyday life.